Imagine finally achieving your dream, moving into the ranch you worked so hard for, only to have the police called on you by someone who thought you didn't belong. That's exactly what happened to me. This is the story of how my first day in my dream home turned into a nightmare. Buying a ranch had always been a dream, not just any dream, but the kind of vision that keeps you going through hard times. Years of saving, planning, and sacrifices had finally led to this moment. A place with open skies, land that stretched far beyond what the eye could see, and a quiet peace that promised a fresh start. It wasn't just a property, it was the reward for relentless hard work. It symbolized freedom, ownership, and the pride of achieving something truly personal. The journey to owning this ranch hadn't been easy. From navigating the real estate market to securing financing and dealing with endless paperwork, every step required patience and determination. There were moments of doubt, when the dream seemed too far out of reach, when bank delays, inspections, or budget constraints made it feel like the goal might slip away. But persistence won. Finally, the keys were in hand, and the day had come to begin a new chapter. The move-in day was filled with excitement and anticipation. Every item packed, every box loaded, represented a piece of life being transported into a space that would soon be home. The thought of waking up to sunrises over the hills and spending evenings under a sky full of stars was more than enough motivation to push through the exhaustion of the move. Friends and family were ready to help, offering support and laughter, making the experience even more memorable. There's something deeply emotional about walking into a home that you've worked years to own. Each corner of the ranch held potential: a future garden, a space for animals, maybe even a spot for weekend bonfires. It was a blank canvas full of possibilities. Standing on your own land for the first time brings a sense of pride that can't be described. It was a personal win, a moment of accomplishment that nobody could take away, or so it seemed at the time. The property itself had everything imagined in the perfect getaway: a sturdy home, enough land to breathe, and a neighborhood that appeared calm and orderly. From the outside, it looked like a tight-knit, well-kept community, quiet, clean, and peaceful. At least that's what it looked like before any actual interaction happened. At that point, there was no reason to believe that the move-in would be anything but a smooth, celebratory occasion. Everything was going according to plan. The movers were unloading furniture, trucks were parked neatly, and items were being carefully brought into the house. There was no chaos, no mess, nothing disruptive or alarming. It was a normal move-in day, the kind of activity that any homeowner goes through when settling into a new place. Smiles, sweat, and a lot of back and forth. Carrying things inside, that was the entire mood. There was a deep sense of satisfaction in knowing that this land was now home. It wasn't just a place to stay, it was a space to grow, to build, to enjoy life on one's own terms. For anyone who's worked hard to achieve something big, the feeling of finally reaching that milestone is unmatched. This move wasn't just about changing locations. It was about stepping into a new phase of life, one where dreams were no longer distant. They were real, tangible, and finally within grasp. The atmosphere, for a moment, felt perfect. There was hope, a sense of renewal, and a kind of happiness that comes from turning dreams into reality. It was the culmination of planning, praying, and persevering. A powerful reminder that anything is possible with focus and faith. But sometimes, just when everything feels like it's falling into place, life throws an unexpected curve. What should have been a peaceful and joyful day soon turned into something much different, not because of anything done wrong, but because someone decided that you didn't look like you belonged. What began as a dream realized would soon be interrupted in the most shocking and unnecessary way. Just as everything seemed to be going smoothly, an odd shift in the atmosphere began to take place. There was no loud noise, no incident, no disruption, just the quiet sense that someone was watching. The kind of feeling that creeps in, not from paranoia, but from lived experience. That unmistakable sense of being observed with suspicion rather than curiosity or welcome. At first it was subtle, a figure standing at a distance, arms crossed, eyes locked onto every move. Not a neighbor waving hello or offering a warm greeting, but someone clearly analyzing the situation with judgment. There was no smile, no introduction, only scrutiny. The kind of stare that doesn't say, "Welcome," but rather, "Why are you here?" The woman appeared to be middle-aged, dressed neatly, and carried herself with an air of authority that didn't come from any official title, but from the confidence of someone used to having control over her environment. She didn't approach. She didn't ask questions. Instead, she stood with a phone in hand, taking in every detail like she was gathering evidence. Every box being carried, every item unloaded, seemed to be triggering some kind of alarm in her mind. Then came the phone call. It was visible from across the way, quick dialing, speaking into the phone with pointed gestures toward the property. There was no conversation with the homeowner, no attempt to ask what was going on or confirm the facts. The assumption had already been made. She believed something illegal was happening, not because of any suspicious behavior, but because in her eyes the people moving in didn't look like they belonged. The call to the authorities was made with confidence. She likely used phrases like, "I don't feel safe," "They're taking things out of the house," or "I've never seen them before." These are the kinds of statements that rely less on truth and more on perception. Perception often influenced by bias, stereotypes, or personal discomfort. When someone like that speaks with certainty, authorities often respond without question. Within minutes, the police were on their way. Lights, sirens, uniforms. The arrival wasn't quiet, and it wasn't discreet. It was loud enough to alert the neighborhood. Suddenly, the peaceful move-in transformed into a public spectacle. Officers stepping out, hands near their belts, voices raised. Not aggressive, but certainly alert. Neighbors began to peek from windows. Some came outside, pretending to water lawns or walk dogs, curious to see what the commotion was about, Same people who hadn't said hello earlier were now interested in watching how this story would unfold. Whispers started, and assumptions flew through the air. It didn't matter that nothing illegal was happening. The mere presence of police gave the illusion of wrongdoing. All of it stemmed from one person deciding to jump to conclusions. One person choosing to make a phone call instead of starting a conversation. One person letting suspicion override decency. This wasn't about enforcing rules or maintaining safety. It was about control, about asserting power under the mask of community concern. The most frustrating part was the lack of accountability. The woman, often labeled a Karen in today's terms, felt completely justified in her actions. In her mind, she was protecting the neighborhood, maintaining order. She saw herself as a guardian of the community, despite never actually being at risk. She wasn't sorry for the trouble she caused because in her eyes, calling the police was the right thing to do. Even after learning the truth, there was no apology, only a defensive attitude and perhaps quiet embarrassment masked as indifference. What made the experience worse wasn't just the inconvenience of the police showing up. It was the feeling of being treated like a criminal on property that was rightfully owned. It was the humiliation of being questioned in front of neighbors, having to prove ownership, justify presence, and remain calm in a situation built entirely on false assumptions. It was the emotional toll of being seen as other, as suspicious, as someone who didn't fit the mold of what a homeowner should look like in that community. That single call reflected a much deeper issue, one that affects countless people, across neighborhoods, cities, and states. The issue of being misjudged based on appearance, assumptions, and prejudice. It wasn't just about a mistaken identity. It was about being denied the right to exist peacefully in a space earned through hard work and sacrifice. The arrival of the police brought a sudden and jarring shift in the tone of the day. What had begun as a celebration of new beginnings was now shadowed by flashing lights and the weight of suspicion. The officers arrived under the impression that a crime might be in progress. Despite the peaceful environment, their presence carried authority and a demand for immediate compliance. The questions started quickly. Identification was requested. Explanations were demanded. There was little room for warmth or understanding. The tone was professional but firm, underlined with a hint of caution. The assumption was clear. This might be a burglary in progress, and the people present were potential suspects. There was no initial space for benefit of the doubt. The frustration in having to prove ownership of one's own property was immense. Despite having documents, keys, and evidence of legal ownership, the burden of proof seemed heavy. It wasn't just about paperwork. It was about demeanor, tone, and behavior. The officers weren't aggressive, but their questions reflected an undercurrent of disbelief. It was as if the reality of owning the home had to be constantly reaffirmed to challenge the narrative they had been given. Each answer, each detail provided, slowly chipped away at the assumption. The moving truck was rented under the correct name. The address matched the paperwork. Utility bills, ID, closing documents, all lined up perfectly. Piece by piece, the officers began to realize that the story they had been told didn't align with the truth unfolding in front of them. There was no theft, no criminal activity, just a family moving into a home they had rightfully purchased. The moment of realization brought an awkward shift. The officers' tone softened slightly, their posture relaxed, but there was no apology, no acknowledgement of the inconvenience or the stress caused. Their job, they might argue, was to respond, to calls and verify the facts. And while that's true, the deeper impact of the encounter remained unaddressed. The psychological weight of being treated like a criminal for doing something as ordinary as moving into a home was left entirely on the shoulders of the homeowner. The situation could have escalated. Many similar stories have ended badly, not because of actual danger, but because of miscommunication, fear, and prejudice. Thankfully, in this case, it didn't. But the emotional toll was undeniable. The humiliation of being questioned, of having neighbors watch as officers combed through details, was deeply unsettling. It created a sense of exposure, a sense of being singled out without cause. The police completed their check, reported back to dispatch, and eventually left. But the damage lingered. The joy of move-in day had been tainted by a situation that should never have occurred. There was no comfort in being cleared, only a lingering sense of violation. No one should have to validate their right to exist in their own space. No one should have to justify their presence in a home they legally own. The encounter also raised difficult questions. Would the police have responded the same way if the call had described a different demographic? Would they have arrived with sirens if the caller hadn't expressed such urgency or fear? Would the situation have even occurred if bias hadn't influenced someone's perception of who looks like they belong in a certain neighborhood? These questions don't have easy answers, but they reveal uncomfortable truths about how deeply prejudice can shape our everyday lives. After the officers left, the process of moving resumed, but the atmosphere was forever changed. What was meant to be a joyful transition had become a stark reminder of the challenges still faced, even in moments of personal success. Trust in the community had been broken before it had a chance to form. The illusion of acceptance had been shattered by a single phone call. The ordeal left behind not just stress and frustration, but also determination. Determination to speak up, to share the story, to ensure that what happened wouldn't be silenced or brushed aside. Because the truth is, situations like this happen far too often, and unless people speak out, nothing changes. This wasn't just about one false accusation. It was about a system of assumptions, fears, and responses that can undermine even the most basic human dignity. In the days following the incident, The silence from the woman who initiated it was louder than any apology could have been. There was no knock on the door, no effort to clear the air, no acknowledgement of the unnecessary escalation. Instead, she carried on as though nothing had happened, maintaining the same rigid demeanor and cold glances whenever paths crossed. It was clear that in her mind she had done the right thing, and that was perhaps the most unsettling part of it all. The lack of accountability revealed a disturbing truth. Some people believe their actions are always justified, especially when cloaked in the guise of community concern. Rather than admitting a mistake, the woman doubled down. She was later overheard justifying her actions to others, using vague phrases like, "better safe than sorry," or, "I just didn't recognize them." These kinds of statements don't express regret. They excuse behavior rooted in bias and shield it under the illusion of responsibility. Conversations with other neighbors revealed a mix of reactions. A few quietly expressed sympathy, saying they heard what happened and thought it was unfair. But most stayed silent, not wanting to take sides or create conflict within the community. Some even nodded in agreement with the woman's version of events, reinforcing the idea that her call to the police was somehow reasonable. The feeling of being alienated began to settle in, not because of anything wrong done, but because comfort and convenience took priority over fairness and truth. Interactions with the HOA itself were equally disappointing. No one from the association reached out to apologize or offer support. When approached, they claimed the HOA had no role in the incident and that neighbors are encouraged to report anything suspicious. This carefully worded response avoided liability while subtly reinforcing the behavior that caused the problem in the first place. There was no acknowledgement of the emotional distress or the damage done to the sense of belonging that every homeowner deserves. The HOA's stance reflected a broader issue. Policies written to maintain order can easily be used to exclude, harass, or control. In theory, homeowner associations exist to protect community standards. In practice, they sometimes empower individuals to enforce personal biases under the protection of rules. This imbalance allows certain personalities to dominate, turning community living into a hostile environment for anyone who doesn't conform to narrow expectations. As time went on, it became clear that the woman's actions were not just a one-time misunderstanding. Other residents shared similar stories: minor conflicts, cold interactions, unexplained complaints. It appeared she had a pattern of inserting herself into situations where she was neither needed nor welcome. Her behavior wasn't about safety, it was about control, and she seemed to thrive on the unspoken influence she held in the neighborhood. Rather than backing down or allowing her behavior to intimidate, a decision was made to stand firm. Not with aggression, but with presence. Being visible, taking part in community events, engaging with neighbors, even those who initially kept their distance, became an act of quiet resistance. Every friendly wave, every normal day spent outdoors, was a reminder that this home was earned, and no amount of suspicion or judgment could change that. Still, the emotional fallout lingered. Trust in the community had been fractured. There was a constant awareness that eyes might be watching, not out of curiosity, but with scrutiny. Moving through daily routines with that in the back of the mind created a layer of anxiety that didn't exist before. It was a feeling of having to prove worthiness again and again, just to exist peacefully in a space that was already owned. This wasn't just about a neighbor overstepping boundaries. It was about the way authority and fear intertwine, about how quickly a person can go from being a homeowner to being treated like a trespasser, and about how often those who instigate harm walk away without ever being held accountable. The woman who called the police faced no consequences. She wasn't corrected, wasn't reprimanded, wasn't even questioned by the people who should have known better. Her silence, her refusal to apologize, spoke volumes. It sent a message that people like her can make dangerous assumptions and never face the discomfort of being wrong. That kind of power, left unchecked, breeds a culture where exclusion is normalized and suspicion is accepted without question. Until that changes, until communities learn to question not just the presence of a stranger but the motives behind that suspicion, the cycle will continue. What happened during the move-in wasn't just an isolated misunderstanding. It was a reflection of a much larger and more troubling issue that continues to affect people in communities across the country. The experience highlighted how deeply ingrained prejudice, bias, and fear can influence even the most routine situations, like moving into a new home. When someone feels entitled to question your presence, simply based on appearance or assumption, it reveals a mindset that goes beyond neighborly concern and enters the realm of discrimination. Owning a home is more than just a financial investment. It represents stability, progress, and personal achievement. For many, especially those from marginalized backgrounds, homeownership is a milestone that often comes after years of effort and overcoming systemic barriers. It is a symbol of belonging. So when that hard-earned accomplishment is challenged or invalidated, it delivers a message that says, "You're still not welcome here, no matter how much you've worked for it." The emotional impact of that message cannot be overstated. Being viewed as suspicious for simply existing in your own space causes a deep, lasting sense of injustice. It forces people to question whether they'll ever truly be accepted, even when they've followed all the rules. It places an unfair burden on individuals to constantly prove their legitimacy, while those who make false assumptions rarely face any accountability. This experience speaks to the need for serious conversations about what safety and community really mean. True safety is not about excluding people who look or live differently. It's not about acting on gut feelings that are rooted in bias. It's about building trust, communication, and understanding among neighbors. It's about creating spaces where people feel secure, not because others are watching them, but because everyone is treated with respect and fairness. Communities thrive when diversity is embraced, not feared. When homeowners, renters, and neighbors are seen as equals, regardless of background, there's more potential for connection, collaboration, and growth. But that can only happen if residents are willing to examine their own biases and challenge the systems that protect discrimination under the guise of policy or concern. One of the biggest lessons from this experience is the power of speaking up. Staying silent only reinforces the status quo. Sharing uncomfortable truths, even when it feels vulnerable, is essential to driving awareness and change. Stories like this aren't rare. They happen often, but they don't always get told. That silence allows harmful behavior to continue unchecked. But when people speak out, it exposes the cracks in the system and forces others to pay attention. It also challenges those who witness these events to ask themselves hard questions. What would they have done in that situation? Would they have stood by quietly? Or would they have spoken up? Would they have believed the worst without evidence or taken the time to understand the full picture? These questions are uncomfortable but necessary, because progress only happens when people are willing to look inward and take responsibility for the role they play, whether as an instigator, a bystander, or an ally. Another key takeaway is the importance of resilience. While the situation was upsetting and unjust, it didn't succeed in driving the new homeowners away. They stayed. They continued to live, thrive, and build in that space. They refused to be intimidated or erased. That kind of quiet strength sends its own powerful message, that people have every right to exist in any space they legally and rightfully occupy. And no amount of side glances, assumptions, or unnecessary police visits can take that away. This story is a call for empathy, accountability, and change. It's a reminder that actions have consequences, especially when they're rooted in prejudice. It urges HOAs, law enforcement, and neighbors to rethink the way they respond to difference, to move away from fear-based decisions and toward ones grounded in fairness and respect. At the end of the day, everyone deserves to feel safe, respected, and welcome in their own home. That's not just a hope, it's a right. And until that right is guaranteed for everyone, stories like this will continue to surface. But by speaking up, standing firm, and refusing to accept discrimination as normal, each story becomes a step toward a more just and inclusive future. Subscribe to Expose HOA Karen for more real stories that uncover bias, demand accountability, and stand up for justice in our communities.